The views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of KSMQ Public Service Media Incorporated or its assigns.
Thank you for joining us on Farm Connections. I'm Dan Hoffman, and the guest this evening is Dennis, a local expert on art and also an art dealer from Rochester. Thanks for joining us again on Farm Connections. Dennis, tell us a little bit about your work and maybe a little bit about your background. How did you get to be an art dealer?
Well, thank you very much. It's good of you to have me here on Farm Connections. I've been an art dealer for about 35 years, now living in Rochester, but I'm originally from New England, from the Burlington, Vermont area, and have been interested in old pictures for a very long time. When I first moved to Rochester, I started to go to museums in the Twin Cities and the local areas to see what the early artists were doing up here in this region, and found that a great many names that I was familiar with are handled by these museums, and was very pleased and felt quite at home. And actually was amazed that they had made the trek up here that I didn't know about. So I got more interested and started to read about it, and I was actually seeking these pictures. It actually filled in a lot of gaps in my knowledge by living here in the Minnesota area for about 8 years now.
Well, we're glad you joined us.
Thank you very much. Once again, thanks for having me.
And when you speak of Minnesota art and agriculture, what comes to mind? Did you bring some samples in for us?
Yeah, actually I did. I brought a few things for the audience to take a look at. The first picture on your screen is a painting that I own, actually, by Jerome Thompson. It's a big painting. It's 24 by 36 inches wide, and it's on your screen. It depicts a brave showing a white girl through the marshes in Crystal, Minnesota. And Jerome Thompson was a New England artist, born in Maine, who worked in Vermont and other parts of New England, depicting farmers nooning, farmers gathering the crop, and a lot of times couples courting and sparking in the romantic atmosphere of New England. What I didn't know was that he had moved to Minnesota in 1867 when he painted this picture to visit his sister, who was a missionary to the Ojibwa people, and he liked it so much that he bought a farm and stayed here for a number of years. And what I just discovered about my painting here is that that the canoe that the brave is showing the white girl through the marshes with, she's gathering water lilies, by the way, is a rice canoe. And it was an important crop for the Indians in that area. And the way I discovered that is I went to a gold rush flea market in the Rochester area, and an antique dealer from Michigan brought such a canoe, and we were discussing it, and I was amazed at how small it was. And he said, "That's a rice canoe." And I put two and two together and figured out that that's a rice canoe in the painting. So that's just a brand new discovery, and I'm pleased that that you can see it too. The way it was used, evidently, is the Indians would go through the marshes and beat the rice down into the boat from the sides, and they may have used a paddle or something like that as they passed through, and the crop would end up in the bottom of the boat. And here the young brave is actually on foot in the marsh, and she's riding along and picking water lilies. So he did a whole series of these things that were here in Minnesota. Indians hunting geese, young couples hanging out. And a very important painting by him is in the collection in Minneapolis, perhaps in the Historical Society, of Minnehaha Falls with her at the base of the falls. And that's the best known painting by Jerome Thompson here in Minnesota. It's a very small painting.
But it's beautiful. I love the colors.
Yeah.
And it talks a little. It shows us, or talks to us, I should say, in terms of how Crystal might have looked like.
Evidently, yeah, it was quite a bit of, there were quite a few marshes, and you told me the other day that it's been filled in. It's now a suburb of Minneapolis. Well, that's right. They filled it in with land, and they built on it. This is what it used to look like in 1867. Minnesota was only a state for about 7 or 8 years at that point in time, and this was the country. This was the country then, and it's great to see what it looks like. And these are typical spring-like colors that you'll see up there. The red bushes, the flowers are really very beautiful, and the painting is very highly detailed. Jerome Thompson was a specialist in landscape and genre, where he has people doing things in a landscape, and this follows with his New England paintings of couples and farmers taking it easy, doing things together, and this was his specialty, and it's interesting that he carried it on here in Minnesota, but he really moves towards Indian subjects as evidenced by his body of work. Thank you for asking about it. Yeah.
And Dennis, to this day, wild rice is a very important crop in Minnesota, both on a domestic production, commercially produced, and also the Indian or Native American, much as in this canoe. They still do it similarly.
Yeah, I saw a documentary on gathering rice in northern Minnesota, and it is produced in the same way, although they try to commercialize it as much as possible. I think the Indians still continue to gather it when they can in this way. I love to cook with it too. I like to eat it.
Delicious.
Yes, it is.
And do you have any other photos?
Yeah, next photo, if you wouldn't mind. This is painted a little before my painting. This is a painting by Seth Eastman, who was a captain in the U.S. Army at Fort Snelling, and he was really a good artist who trained in art at West Point. And when he was stationed at the fort, he began to do these wonderful wonderful pictures of the Indians at their teepees, dancing, and in this case shooing the crows away from the cornfields. And this is how it was done. If you take a look at what's going on here, it tells the whole story. The Indians, usually women, and there are 3 of them in this painting, would climb up on these stands, on these platforms, and beat drums and wave things to scare the crows away from the crop. And here's a really perfect example of Seth Eastman at his best. This painting was collected by the famous railroad industrialist in St. Paul, J.J. Hill, who accomplished the Great Northern Railroad all the way out to Seattle. This is a 19-inch wide. This is a 19-inch wide watercolor, or oil possibly, that is directly out of his own collection. He was a big collector of Seth Eastman's work. Eastman and his wife were both sympathetic to the Indians, and he was a particularly good artist who was following on the traditional of a lot of earlier explorer artists who came into the region and were commissioned by the military to do surveys of the topography. You know, before photography, the artists depicted the region, and there were a number of very early artists before Seth Eastman who went as far as the Pacific Ocean, and the most famous ones are the Lewis and Clark expedition. Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition was a wonderful draftsman and frontiersman, and it was perhaps more important to the expedition than even Meriwether Clark. There's a fine museum in Great Falls, Montana about their epic voyage. It was commissioned by Thomas Jefferson in 1803 and started in 1804 the following year, and they went all the way up. Well, they went all the way up over the Rockies and all the way to the Pacific Ocean, drawing and depicting the life that they found along the way. And they became very important. It was very important for Jefferson and the young country to have this record. They didn't really know what they had, and they wanted to know. So they sent artists out, later on military guys, who who depicted the topography of the landscape. They wanted to, it was very important for military purposes to know what the topography was and what they had to do to control the land and the territory. So Clark was their draftsman, and he didn't do that many pictures of Indians and their habits, but he was the first who depicted the Missouri River all the way up and over to the Pacific coast. There were
excuse me, but on this piece of lovely art, how do you think this helped agriculture get started in the Upper Midwest?
Well, it's a long story, but it's an obvious story. The dirt here, the soil, is the richest soil perhaps in the world here in this region, and it's so easy to grow good crops. Where I come from, to clear a field, the farmer had to cut all the forest down first, and then the hardest part was to remove the rocks and the boulders that were in the thin soil. And a lot of them got discouraged and moved west until they came to this region and realized that the earth was, in some cases, 20 inches thick. The black earth was about 20 inches thick. Even in my backyard in Rochester, there's a part of the yard where the contractor didn't get his hands on all the topsoil, and it's over 12 inches of black earth in my backyard, and it really stuns me to see it. So the great soil is part of this story of why expansion to the west happened.
Do you think that Thomas Jefferson and other presidents that commissioned this work maybe used that as a recruiting tool to get farmers, agriculturists, and people to travel west? Yeah,
they needed to settle the land. They needed to get people out here, and the first thing that they did was they surveyed it. They sent early artists, and then the military came in and started forts such as Fort Snelling. Long about 1855, the railroad really started to come. The early settlers and tourists and early artists started to come in the 1850s. But when the first iron bridge across the Mississippi River happened at, I believe it was in Davenport, then it really opened up the territory, because before that the people had to come by a combination of rail, stagecoach, and steam up the Mississippi River.
And with previewing your lovely art, I'm sure you've got some more of those?
Sure. Let's have the next photograph. Let's see what, oh, this is it. Perfect segue, Dan. This is a nice painting by, I think it's by Rossiter, and this painting is in the White House. It depicts steamboat traffic on the Mississippi River, and this spot is Lake Pepin. And so the steamboat would bring not only passengers but also goods, grain, and would take away product from the mills up in Minneapolis and back down to market. As I said, before the railroad, I imagine they took the products all the way down to New Orleans and then out through the Gulf of Mexico. But after the Rock Island Railroad crossed the Mississippi at Davenport, I'm sure that it went east on rail. And here's a beautiful painting. Here's a very beautiful painting that whenever I watch the show West Wing, I always point out to my wife that this is Lake Pepin. This is right up here in Minnesota, and it's really quite a landmark. Maybe we can have the next
sure.
Photograph. And these are mills. These are mills at St. Anthony's Falls in Minneapolis, and well, when you have mills, well, what does that imply? It means that there's a product that's being milled, and it's obviously corn and wheat, perhaps, and became the largest milling center in the world due to its proximity to water power, good shipping opportunities, and great soils. So
good farmers, and they also used them for sawmills.
Yeah, and that's right. And the great forests north of the cities were an important industry also. They also used the Great Lakes to ship out the products of the Iron Range, which they used to build the rails that came to full circle back to Minnesota. And when that happened, it really opened up the West. Can we have the next photo, please? This is a very interesting photograph out of a book. I couldn't get a better photo. I'm sorry. Painting is by Thomas P. Rossiter, and it's out of this excellent book by Rena Newman Cohen. The book was published about 35 years ago here in Minnesota, and it depicts a Minnesota farm, and it looks much like the land that I experienced driving from Rochester to Minneapolis. It has that nice rolling country. But here's a Minnesota farm in 1865, and it has a lean-to, a farmhouse, the beginning of fencing, and a few farm animals, and these interesting straw piles, which you pointed out might be actual storage facilities. What did you tell me about that?
Thanks for
that
asking,
way of storing
Dennis,
hay.
But according to my father, when Grandpa first moved onto his farm, he didn't have a barn, and of course Minnesota winters are very harsh. So he built a pole structure with a wood lattice, and then took the thrashing machine and blew straw on top, and that was the barn for the first winter. So very likely those inside of those straw piles could have been used for livestock housing, or maybe even housing itself.
I believe that's what's being depicted here by Rossiter in his painting titled Minnesota Prairie, 1865. And at the time this painting was put into the book, the painting was the property of the University of Minnesota Gallery up in Minneapolis. And the painting is 14 by 24 inches. It's a very nice example of a local, in the beginning of agriculture in Minnesota. Next picture, please. Oh, and this is back to this is also by Rossiter, and this is back to the opening up of the West using the railroads. Here we have a roundhouse and some, excuse me for looking away from the camera all the time, and early steam trains who are making their way into the region. And it looks like the landscape around Winona to me, because it's hilly. It's not as flat as in the previous picture by Rossiter.
Looks like it depicts man changing landscape.
Oh, yeah.
We saw some early ones where there was really no presence other than maybe a canoe, and all of a sudden we're seeing bridges and steam and coal engines and steam engines.
After 1855, and when they crossed the Big Muddy, the Mississippi, they really started to go in all directions, and it really started to open up. It was enough is made of it. You know about the importance of the railroad, but it really was a really big deal, and it really started to get a lot of people into the territory. And here's the Iron Horse doing its thing here in Minnesota. Here's another painting. This is much later in the timeline. This is a WPA painting. The WPA was a program started during the Depression under Franklin Roosevelt's administration to get work to people who were unemployed. And there were three efforts. There were people that did labor in the national parks and other places. There was an effort to get artists employed and theater people, and it was known as the Works Progress Administration. And these artists worked in the 30s depicting scenes here in Minnesota. This is by an artist by the name of Fennell, I believe, and it depicts a farmer and his wife. She's carrying posts to him, and he's digging them and putting them in the ground. They're actually building fences, and this is what this depicts. I'm sorry, this is by Glenn Ranney, and he's a listed painter in the national records, and recently some of his works came up at auction in Illinois, and some sold and some didn't. But here's a very interesting painting that merits some consideration by people who might want to consider collecting Minnesota artwork. And it's interesting to see where they were at in the 30s. They're still digging fences by hand, and they have a nice gambrel roof barn and some ventilation at the top, and nice rolling land which looks tillable. And
excellent. Dennis, we've got about 7 minutes, and I know you've got some
oh,
great
my goodness.
art yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well here's another painting by Randy, and it's another Minnesota farm with a wild sky, and it looks like early autumn. And the reason I included it in the show is because it's quite a typical Minnesota farm with a Dutch-style barn and a silo, and the fields look like they're already gathered up. Next picture, please. Another painting by Stanford Fennell. It's a gouache, it's not an oil painting, and it's from 1936. And this was formerly the property of the St. Paul Public Library, which evidently had quite a few of these in their collection. They may have been a gathering point after the WPA, and were depicted on the walls of that library. The reason I included it, there's a nice corn crib on the left, which is a way of drying the corn, and silo, which I learned is a way to ferment the stalks and the corn to change the nutrient value of the product. The next, we're really moving along.
You're doing great.
The next, this is a world famous painting by Grant Wood of Iowa, but this is a genre painting, and it's a psychological painting, and became world famous, made Grant Wood world famous, and I'm sure that many of the people in this audience know this work. It tells a story it tells a story of people, and if you look at them and what's behind them, you can see that you can infer a lot about what they feel like and what their times were like, and what their lives really are like. These are farm people, and it really pertains to this whole region, as a matter of fact. That's why I included it. Next picture. And here's an artist that's working in the style of Grant Wood. This is an artist by the name of David Granahan, and this painting that he's working on is the mural in the Hopkins, Minnesota post office, painted in the 1930s. And Grant Wood did fields just like this, these out of perspective rows of corn. And here's an artist doing a Minnesota painting. And here's a photograph of him doing it right on the wall of the post office. Thank you. Next picture. Oh, this is one of the most wonderful paintings of this region that I've ever come across, and it's in the collection of the Minnesota Marine Museum in Winona, which is really a fantastic collection of paintings. And a treasure for this whole region. This painting is by Alfred Thompson Britcher, and it depicts these granaries and these warehouses on the Mississippi in 1870. And this is Alfred Thompson Britcher, one of the most important Hudson River painters at the height of his powers. It's a wonderful painting that, for our purposes, depicts agriculture and warehousing on the river, but its beauty is just superb. There's a storm passing over, and there are steamboats that are pointed north towards Minnesota. And this artist, as a matter of fact, is known to have come up as far as St. Paul. This is truly one of the finest American artists, and everyone in the area, if they're interested, should go and see the Minnesota Marine Museum in Winona, because it's a treasure trove of truly remarkable paintings. Not just regional, but also international. There's a Van Gogh in the museum. Wow. There are several Monets. There's a Winslow Homer. Very, very big names. And it's quite a generous gift to the town of Winona by Bob Kierlin, I believe his name is. He was the founder of Fastenal Corporation. That museum is one of the finest little museums I've ever come across.
Fascinating tip, and it's right in our backyard.
That's right. Everybody should go there.
So you've picked our interest in art, and specifically regional and agricultural art. So I hope our audience all goes over to Winona or Minneapolis or Rochester, wherever there is an art museum. Dennis, you were kind enough to bring a beautiful piece of work into the studio. Could you tell us just a little bit about that? We've got about 2 minutes left.
Okay. This is a painting by William Metcalf, who was an illustrator, and you can see that in the artwork. It's a completely different style of work. It's in my collection. I own this painting. I found it in St. Paul at a dealer show, and it depicts farm kids who are leaving the Cahill School, which, as it turns out, I only found this out today, is in Edina, and here they are spilling out of the school at the best time of day for them. That's the end of the day, end of school. They're jumping on a wagon it looks like this drover or teamster is going to take them home. But in any event, they're playing, and they are happy as can be to be finished with their school day. It's extremely well done. This artist worked for the Brown and Bigelow Calendar Company of St. Paul, and they did illustrations for books and for calendars and you know, other purposes. I'm very happy to own this picture, and I consider it to be one of his best compositions. It doesn't have very many flaws at all. It's really amazing how well this artist can do a figure, and they're all working together. There's a relationship between all these kids. They're pointing at each other and having fun, and it's a rollicking good time that they're having. And we as grown-ups can remember our days when we were this age and we're getting out of school.
Art, you make art just come alive, Dennis. It's wonderful. You know, beautiful piece of our history. Dennis, if somebody in our audience would like to know more information, let's say they find something in the attic.
Oh, yeah.
What is this I found? Is it valuable? What does it mean? How do they get a hold of you? Have you got a phone number?
Oh, sure. If you'd like to have a picture appraised, my phone number is 507-281-7954. I'm in Rochester. I much prefer to buy paintings than to appraise them, but if a person has a painting that they'd like to have appraised, it's a pleasure to see it, first of all, and perhaps I can help them. I love doing it, and it's always a pleasure to see what's out there in attics and in people's homes. The Antiques Roadshow has really made this process really familiar to people, and I'd be happy to take a look for anybody.
What a great service! And if it happens to be a family heirloom, maybe you can help them interpret it, and even maybe give them some tips on care, preservation, displaying, more tips on museums, that sort of thing. Dennis, you've been a wonderful guest, wealth of knowledge. I'm totally impressed. Here's a man that came from Vermont and made a living trading art right here in our southeast Minnesota territory.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's been
absolutely fun.
A pleasure.
Thank you, Dan.
So much. For more information, log on to ksmq.org and click on Farm Connections. There you can find past episodes and participate with the blogs, where you can submit your ideas, and don't forget to email the show at ksmq.org. Tune in next time as we continue discussing the impacts of agriculture on all of us. From everyone at Farm Connections, I'm Dan Hoffman. Thanks for joining us.